There was a plan.
We call it Mars Direct.
A simple yet effective plan to get us from point A to point B.
Columbus is what we remember, not the Borgias taking over the papacy. 500 years from now, people will remember what we do to make their civilization possible. And if you have it in your power to do something great and important and wonderful, then you should.
Though it was never put into practice, it inspired a new generation to dream about one day reaching the Red Planet.
1, 0.
We're at stage 1.
Liftoff indication.
I don't ever give up.
The dream is alive, and we need a plan. A simple, affordable, safe and robust architecture for a mission to Mars in the next 10 years. 4 ships, 6 astronauts, more than 10 simple contingency plans to ensure the survival of the crew.
Why even begin?
When something is important enough, you do it even if the dog's not in your bed.
Mars Direct 3.
Ever since the Apollo lunar landings, a human mission to Mars has been part of the collective imagination. Unfortunately, it has rarely been anything else. With space programs focusing on low Earth orbit, there has been an astonishing lack of in-depth Mars mission architectures being seriously considered. Thanks to the current revolution in the space sector, led by SpaceX, a human Mars mission seems once again within reach. There is will, there are resources, and there will soon be technology to allow such an endeavor. Now, there is need for a detailed plan for a SpaceX, or otherwise, crewed Mars mission architecture. To be viable, a Mars mission architecture needs to be simple, meaning not unnecessarily complex, sufficiently detailed, affordable and safe, all while staying within the reach of current technology. So far, of the plans that have been seriously considered, only the original Mars Direct architecture, conceived by Robert Zubrin, David A. Baker and Owen Wayne in the 1990s, has fulfilled these criteria. More than 30 years have passed since the publication of Mars Direct. Since then, a new era of space industry has started. Inspired by Mars Direct and the vision of Mars colonization, SpaceX is leading a revolution in the space sector, with partially and soon fully reusable rockets lowering the cost of payload to orbit and super heavy launch vehicles once again opening the possibility of ambitious crewed missions beyond low Earth orbit. Crucial discoveries have also been made by robotic missions, such as the confirmation of large deposits of water ice beneath the surface of Mars in mid-latitudes. At this time, SpaceX is preparing for the first orbital mission of their Starship system, which they intend to use for their Mars program. However, they have not publicly disclosed a detailed architecture for such mission, and have stated that their focus is on the development of the vehicle. Their current plan is to launch starships to the surface of Mars aided by on-orbit refueling, deploy large amounts of solar panels on the surface, extract ice from the Martian underground, use it to produce Methalox fuel, and go back to Earth. In 2019, Dr. Robert Zubrin presented Mars Direct 2, a modification of SpaceX's plan suggesting the use of the Starship system as a heavy launch vehicle to launch a different and smaller vehicle to low Earth orbit, or a highly elliptical orbit nearing Earth escape. This smaller ship would finish the trans-Mars ejection and land there. The main reason behind his suggestion is to reduce the amount of power required to create the fuel needed for the return to Earth. The proposed mini-starship would require around a factor of 5 less fuel while delivering, in the elliptical orbit configuration, around a third of the cargo. There are, however, 3 main concerns with these two architectures. Concern 1. Reliance on water extraction and processing to produce the fuel for the return trip. The extraction and processing of large amounts of water from the Martian soil may seem like a manageable task. Large deposits of ice have been found, and the chemical processes, water electrolysis, carbon dioxide electrolysis, and the Sabatier reaction, are all well known. Nevertheless, there are a number of risks associated with these operations. The machinery may have been damaged on the trip from Earth to Mars. Ice may be found to be inaccessible or scarce on site. Major damage caused by human error may not be recoverable. Soil contaminants in the water may damage the machinery if not filtered correctly. Some of these issues may appear at any point during the 400 days these operations would take to process hundreds of tons of water, and, however unlikely they may be, they would prevent a return to Earth. Basically, we have a good idea of what the soil is like on the few regions where we've landed rovers. We know more or less what's in most of the planet's soil thanks to satellites, but we've never been there. Processes are developed and streamlined by trial and error, when you know the land and have tried a bunch of things until one works. Arriving on a new place, let alone a new planet, and relying on setting up a small industrial operation for your survival is risky to say the least. Concern 2. Large energy requirement. Pioneer Astronautics demonstrated a reactor capable of producing 1 kilogram a day of Methalox fuel from hydrogen and carbon dioxide while consuming a power of 700 watts. The one you see is a scaled-up version. Assuming 400 days to produce the 710 tons of fuel needed for SpaceX's plan, 352 tons of water would be required. Adding the power cost of electrolyzing that water implies the need for at least 1.89 megawatts of power. With the assumptions made in the paper you can find in the description, the solar infrastructure necessary for that would be 229.2 tons in mass, 3,437.4 cubic meters in volume, and 57,290 square meters in area. The deployment of this infrastructure would require in the order of 5 starships, volume being the limiting factor, as well as significant deployment operations and maintenance. Power remains one of the most significant challenges of a Mars mission architecture that accounts for the return of the astronauts. As with the first issue, failure in this area would result in loss of crew. Mars Direct 2 significantly reduces the power requirement. Unfortunately, the smaller ship would be able to carry less mass per flight. Still, the reduction in fuel and power need is smaller than the cargo capacity penalty, so it would be an improvement. Concern 3. Lack of detail. SpaceX's focus is currently on the development of the Starship system, and only the fundamentals of a Mars mission have been publicly disclosed. This is not necessarily bad. Hardware development is crucial, but it's insufficient. A number of companies and organizations are also working on different technologies regarding Mars missions, from spacecraft to rover concepts, aeroponics, base simulations, and colony concept designs. But this is far from a coordinated approach. Apart from Starship, no technologies or hardware are being developed for any specific mission profile. Whether rovers will be needed or not, pressurized or not, etc., are relevant questions regarding the development of hardware. The same applies to a hub, aquaponics, possible use of hydrogen as proposed in the original Mars Direct, how long the transfers between planets would be, oxygen supply, number of ships per mission, cargo delivered, etc. Death is certainly a possibility in a mission to Mars. And even though astronauts are elite professionals who are willing to risk their lives for a bigger cause, the loss of the crew could result in the cancellation of the entire program. Billions of people, including children, would watch as their heroes and hopes quickly or slowly perish. A total failure would result in the death of the crew and do great harm to public morale. This disaster must be avoided. It is for all of these reasons that, at the Mars Society's 2020 International Mars Conference, I presented Mars Direct 3, a mission architecture designed to solve all of the problems mentioned, providing a comprehensive, affordable, and extremely safe approach to the first crewed Mars mission. With safety being the primary goal, the plan is built with a number of backups and contingency plans to account for the failed landing of 3 of the 4 ships, month-long global dust storms, crash landings, failed ISRU, and other incidents that may occur, while still returning astronauts safely to Earth. All of this with only 4 ships landing on the surface of Mars and no significant new technologies needed, ensuring an affordable price. This mission profile is also designed to facilitate future missions and the creation and expansion of a colony. In 2021, after getting permission from Dr. Zubrin to use the Mars Direct name, I supported my presentation with a paper. You can access this paper from the link in the description. There, you will find more information about the numbers and calculations that support this architecture. And now, with no further ado, let's dive into Mars Direct 3. As in the case of Mars Direct 2, the third iteration of Mars Direct makes use of the Starship vehicle in its cargo configuration in order to launch a smaller mass lander to Earth orbit. This vehicle will be larger than in Mars Direct 2, making full use of the Starship's cargo capacity. But one of the key differences of Mars Direct 3 is the use of Starship as a cargo ship to the Martian surface as well. These starships would neither be pressurized nor return to Earth. The combination of a bigger cargo ship and a smaller crewed vehicle is a key innovation for solving the problems described at the beginning. This is the big ship small ship strategy. The plan could be adapted to other launch vehicles, but given SpaceX's current edge in space technology, we will assume the mission to be carried out with their hardware. The plan is also built around Methalox fuel for propulsion and solar panel technology for energy collection, though small-scale surface nuclear fission reactors are also considered. The mission profile for cargo starships landing on Mars will be that described by SpaceX. A Starship is launched to low Earth orbit by a super heavy rocket and then refueled by 5 to 8 Starship tankers, depending on the final cargo capacity of Starship. Once fueled, it performs a trans-Mars ejection burn and finally lands on Mars 6 to 8 months later, using a heat shield and propulsive landing. The final capabilities of the Starship are yet to be determined, but hardware and estimates are reliable enough to make decent projections. The cargo capacity to orbit for Starship is assumed to be around 125 metric tons. For all uncertain values, conservative estimates are made. For more information on the calculations, please check the full paper in the description. The new vehicle proposed in Mars Direct 3 is the Caravel Mars Lander, which is an evolution of the mini Starship described in Mars Direct 2. It is a scaled-down version of Starship, using the same materials, engines, propellants, and heat shield tiles to minimize development cost. This crew-rated vehicle will be launched to orbit by a cargo version of Starship. The Caravel will have a dry mass of 32 tons, with a maximum fuel capacity of 180 tons of methane and oxygen rocket fuel. The ship would have habitable quarters, main and secondary fuel tanks, and be powered by a single Raptor vacuum engine. For purposes of redundancy, it would also have 6 Raptor Junior engines higher up. We will delve into these later. Finally, the ship would contain an unpressurized cargo section and a tanker rover. The size, mass and design of the Caravel are subject to slight change. This preliminary design is for visual purposes. Even with only one Raptor engine throttled down to 40%, a Caravel landing on Mars would still have a thrust-to-weight ratio of 4.1, resulting in a dangerous suicide burn for landing. Relying on a single Raptor engine for such a long mission is also considered dangerous. A solution to this is already present in the designs of the lunar starship concept in the form of smaller, less powerful engines situated higher in the structure of the ship that are used for the landing, though the nature of these engines planned by SpaceX has not yet been disclosed. Mars Direct 3 proposes a small Mythalox engine used for landings. Given when it will be used, it does not need to be optimized for high efficiency. Throttle range is necessary, with a maximum thrust per engine of 8 tons, which is 78.45 kilonewtons, and a throttle limit of 40%. Caravels would need to be equipped with 6 of these engines and be able to land with 4 if required for engine out capacity. This allows for a number of contingencies which will be discussed later. With a dry mass of up to 3 tons, the goal of this unpressurized electric rover is to transport liquid methane and oxygen between ships. For that purpose, it would be equipped with wires and fuel pipes that astronauts can manually connect to the ships. The tanker rover would consist of a wheeled platform containing a battery and one of the secondary fuel tanks of the Caravel, which are detachable and could serve as replacement. The rover would be charged by manual plugging to a ship or solar panel grid. The ship and the rover would be equipped with redundant fuel cells to produce power from the liquid methane and oxygen contained in their tanks. Given the similarity in the temperature conditions that liquid oxygen and liquid methane require, the same hardware could be used to transport both, one at a time. This rover fits and is transported on the lower cargo bay of the Caravel ship, next to the main engine, and lowered to the ground via a crane. The rover can be radio controlled by astronauts. Another version of this rover would exist, but it would be tasked with transporting liquid water instead of methane or oxygen. The purpose of this rover will be clear later on. As in many other architectures, Mars Direct 3 proposes a pressurized rover to be deployed by a starship. This battery-powered rover will have a range of 500 kilometers and allow the astronauts to explore long distances. Smaller half-ton rovers will also be needed to deploy and clean solar panels. Other technologies and hardware needed would include carbon dioxide electrolyzers, wastewater recyclers, gas liquefiers, functional spacesuits, water electrolyzers, machinery for the Sabatier process, a crew habitat, and equipment for the extraction of water. Many of these will not be critical for the survival of the crew, but will allow the astronauts to lay the groundwork for future missions. We saw earlier how starships get to Mars. So, before explaining the entire mission, let us go into the mission profile of a single Caravel ship. The Caravel will be launched inside of a starship in cargo configuration, to which it is docked and connected through retractable support mechanisms. At launch, it would contain less fuel than its full capacity, at 64.3 tons. Added to the 32 tons of the spacecraft and the 26.5 tons of cargo, the mass of the ship would be 122.8 tons. This gives the Caravel a delta V of 2,750 meters per second. a Starship tanker would be waiting for them in low Earth orbit. This tanker, which would already have been refueled in orbit by another one, would transfer all of its excess fuel to the main Starship, then land back on Earth. The Starship proceeds to perform a 2.5 km per second burn that would position it in a highly elliptical orbit. After this, the Caravel would separate from the Starship, which would land back on Earth. Then, the Caravel would perform a 1.8 km per second burn that sends it on a 6-month trajectory to Mars. This makes a total of 3 launches, 2 being tankers, which could be reduced to 2 if on-orbit refueling was possible between a Starship and a Caravel. In this case, after a fuel transfer of 115.5 tons of fuel to the Caravel, its delta V would be 5,210 meters per second, which is enough to perform the trans-Mars injection burn from low Earth orbit. Onwards, we will consider this not to be an option as to remain conservative, but keep in mind that it is possible, and would further reduce cost and complexity, while slightly increasing cost and complexity of the Caravel. The 6-month trajectory is ideal for various reasons. Reducing it from the 9-month maximum reduces the radiation exposure of the astronauts at a reasonable delta V cost, while giving them 3 more months on the surface. But, most importantly, this is a free return trajectory, giving the possibility to abort a mission and return to Earth at a minimum delta V cost without landing on Mars. Further reductions in the duration are more expensive in terms of delta V and result in the loss of the free return. The entry profile would be more conservative than that designed by SpaceX for Starship. The Caravel would aerobrake and perform a propulsive landing using 500 meters per second of delta V. This would give the ship hovering margin and capacity. After 1.5 years on the Martian surface, the Caravel is full with 180 tons of fuel and 5 tons of cargo, giving it 6,550 meters per second of delta V. This is a conservative estimate of the delta V required for the trip from the Martian surface to trans-Earth injection. As stated by Elon Musk, Raptor version 2 is projected to have 230 tons of thrust. At 217 tons, this gives the Caravel a thrust-to-Martian weight ratio of 2.8 at launch. A high thrust-to-weight ratio is essential to reduce delta V losses due to the Martian gravity. The Caravel will launch to low Martian orbit, deploy its solar arrays and perform the trans-Earth injection burn. A Raptor vacuum engine cannot operate in the Earth's lower atmosphere, and the Caravel does not have enough fuel for a propulsive landing. Instead, it aerobrakes into a highly elliptical orbit, then rising the perigee to 300 kilometers at marginal delta V cost. At this point, a cargo Starship is launched to low Earth orbit empty, thus having the delta V necessary to reach this orbit and rendezvous with the Caravel in one launch. The Caravel would dock to the Starship the same way it was when it launched. At 37 tons, the Caravel is within the 50-ton cargo limit that the Starship can land back on Earth. Finally, the Starship would land with the Caravel inside. This approach not only saves delta V from the Caravel, but also increases safety. Starship is designed to be a multi-purpose ship, and after tens or hundreds of regular and tanker missions, the Starship would at this point have perfected the landing procedure. For all of this to be possible, the Caravel would need to be refueled with 180 tons of Methalox fuel on Mars. Given the nature of the Raptor engine, this is 39.6 tons of methane at 22% and 140.4 tons of oxygen at 78%. How can this be done? This is the key question that has made crewed missions to Mars so elusive. As the MOXIE experiment on the Perseverance rover has demonstrated, oxygen can be produced from the Martian atmosphere. Hydrogen, however, must be extracted from water ice underground, and the Sabatier reaction can use carbon dioxide and hydrogen to produce methalox fuel. This is likely the best long-term method for fuel production on Mars, and is the one that SpaceX is currently planning to use. However, as explained before, this is a risky operation for the first crewed mission. Bringing the fuel from Earth has always been an unrealistically expensive proposition. Even at 22% of the total fuel and oxidizer mass, delivering 39.6 tons of liquid methane to the surface of Mars would exhaust more than the entire cargo capacity of the Caravel. An alternative to this, used in the original Mars Direct architecture, would be to bring the hydrogen from Earth, thus eliminating the water requirement. This approach was considered. 10 tons of liquid hydrogen would be needed if not accounting for any losses, and the tank size would be 140 cubic meters. However, the storage of liquid hydrogen for 7 months with reasonably low losses is a challenge at best and an impossibility at worst. In any case, complicated and expensive. Mars Direct 3 offers a simpler and safer alternative, made possible by the big ship small ship strategy. 40 tons of fuel may be too much for a Caravel to transport, but it's only a third of the cargo capacity of a Starship. Remember that the only vehicle that needs to return to Earth is the Caravel, so problem solved. 45 tons are considered to safety. This approach makes the refueling process depending on the ISRU of the Martian atmosphere only, and not the extraction of water from the Martian ice. This is an enormous safety bonus. There is also a significant reduction in the challenge of the production of electricity by using a smaller ship for the return and bigger cargo ships. For the return, 140.4 tons of oxygen would need to be produced. According to engineering studies based on the MOXIE experiment, it is estimated that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere could be electrolyzed at the rate of 1 kg a day, with a supply of 1.714 kilowatts. Scaling up to fit Mars Direct 3, 204.75 kilowatts over a period of 400 days will be needed to produce 140.4 tons of O2. This conservatively assumes no efficiency gain from scaling up bigger than proposed in the study. Small nuclear reactors, such as the kilopower reactor proposed by NASA, would be ideal for this task. Assuming a 1.3 ton 10 kilowatt reactor with a 20% safety margin, this gives us 25 reactors with a mass of 32.5 tons. If nuclear energy is not available for this mission, solar energy is the only alternative. The infrastructure would consist of approximately 24.8 tons of panels, covering an area of 6,209.4 square meters. When stacked inside of the Starship, they would occupy 372.6 cubic meters of the estimated 650 cubic meters of the volume of the Starship cargo bay. This is 4 times less than would be required for a Starship, and 9 times less than a Starship would require to be fully fueled using the Sabatier process. By using the Caravel as well as the Starship, the fuel requirement is that of the former, while the cargo capacity is that of the latter. This means that the energy infrastructure imposes a proportionately smaller mass penalty on the mission. What had to be delivered in 3 launches can now be delivered in 1, with room and mass to spare. Now, we can finally delve into how the mission would play out. Half of the 4 ships, one of them crewed, would launch in each of 2 launch windows. As some of you may know, the orbits of Earth and Mars align every 26 months to allow missions to travel between them. From now on, in order to tell each ship apart, they will be referred to using the names of historic Spanish vessels. Let us start with the first launch window. Starship Victoria. This is a starship in a modified cargo configuration named after the Victoria-class naval ship, the first vessel to ever circumnavigate the world. The main purpose of this vehicle is to be the fuel production facility for this and future missions. You can see the cargo on this ship on your screen, but the three most important elements are the 45 tons of liquid methane in its tanks, solar panels or fission reactors for energy production, and the machinery for in-situ resource utilization. This machinery would consist of carbon dioxide electrolyzers, water electrolyzers, gas liquefiers, and machinery for the Sabatier reaction, as well as a small water storage tank for logistical purposes. Even though there was already a 20% margin for the power production, there is further margin in these figures. The crew must be able to fill or empty both the methane and oxygen tanks, as well as the water tank. For that purpose, pipes reaching the lower part of the ship would connect to each corresponding tank, with redundant pumps and valves for safe operation. Various sockets will also connect to the ship's electrical grid in order for it to be connected to solar panels, rovers, and even other ships, if necessary. For all intents and purposes, after the landing, Starship Victoria would become an industrial building for fuel production and storage. Caravel Pinta. This is a caravel ship named after one of the Caravel-class naval ships on Christopher Columbus's first voyage to America. Even though it would not carry people to Mars, it would still be fully equipped with life support, 2 years of food and supplies, water and waste recycling systems, plenty of room, and everything the astronauts would need. It would have 2 redundant carbon dioxide electrolyzers for oxygen production. In its lower cargo bay, it would carry a fuel tanker rover. Caravel Pinta would go on a 6-month trajectory, while Victoria could take longer. They would land on Mars within a range of 2 kilometers of each other. These landings would demonstrate the capacity of the ships to land on Mars. Once all systems have been checked, Starship Victoria would start deploying the solar panel rovers and loading them with stacks of panels. The carbon dioxide electrolyzers as well as the gas liquefiers aboard Victoria would start operation, slowly filling the liquid oxygen tank for the next 400 days. During this process, the small rovers would clean the panels from dust. If this was successfully completed, the second wave of ships would launch from Earth. 2 ships would launch in the second launch window, 1 crewed and 1 uncrewed. Caravel Niña. This is a Caravel cruise ship named after one of the Caravel-class naval ships on Christopher Columbus's first voyage to America. It would launch 4 to 6 astronauts on a 6-month free return trajectory to Mars and carry similar cargo as the Pinta. The only other difference would be that it would carry the water tanker rover, not the fuel one. Both ships would also carry 20 kilowatts of solar panels. Starship Santa Maria. This is a starship named after the Cara-class naval ship on Christopher Columbus's first voyage to America. This ship was dismantled to make the first Spanish settlement on the New World. As always, you can see the cargo distribution on your screen. This time, the most important pieces of cargo are the pressurized rover, the equipment for ice mining to extract water, and the first module of the Martian base. The Santa Maria will launch on a 7.5-month trajectory, arriving 1.5 months after the Niña. 6 months after the departure, the crewed Niña ship lands on Mars close to the other 2. The crew spends a few hours or days inside of the ship getting used to the gravity and making safety checks. after which they opened the airlock and set foot on the Red Planet. After this, Phase 1 begins. For 1.5 months, the astronauts plant flags, deploy the ship's solar panels, explore the area, and research samples. They would inspect the ship for any sign of damage and walk to the landing site of Starship Victoria and Caravel Pinta, where the fuel tanker rover is deployed. They would deploy the Pinta's solar panels, inspect both ships for damage, and, if no damage is found in any ship, the astronauts would decide which Caravel they would use for the return trip. At this point, both the Pinta and the Niña are fully functional habitats for the crew, and they may choose to live in one, the other, or alternate between both. When the decision is made, they use the fuel tanker rover to take the liquid methane and liquid oxygen from Starship Victoria and fully fuel the chosen Caravel. Once the Caravel is fueled, the tanker rover remains connected to its power grid, and both the ship and the rover use the energy provided by the solar panels to keep the fuel in a cryogenic state. 1.5 months after the crew lands, the Santa Maria starship would land close to the other ships, marking the beginning of Phase 2. The pressurized rover and 1 ton of stacked solar panels are deployed to the ground automatically via the cranes using battery power. The crew walks there and inspects the vehicle to check if it's functional, after which they deploy the solar panels. During the following weeks, the crew would aid in the deployment of the cargo inside. From this point onwards, the crew can use the pressurized rover to explore regions tens or hundreds of kilometers away from where they landed. Once a deposit is found that is abundant in ice and reasonably close to Starship Victoria, the crew marks the spot and returns to Starship Santa Maria. There, the rover is equipped with a towing, and the crew uses it to transport the extraction machinery and the necessary solar panels to the location. The remaining ones are installed in the main solar panel farm next to Starship Victoria. This marks the beginning of Phase 3. When the extraction and filtering is tested, the crew returns to the Niña, deploys the water tanker rover, drives it to the water extraction machinery, and connects the water pipes to it. Water is pumped in, and, once full, the tanker rover is driven to Starship Victoria, where the water is pumped in for the electrolysis process to begin. This step is repeated multiple times as the water is electrolyzed and the Sabatier reaction reacts atmospheric carbon dioxide with the produced hydrogen to create oxygen and methane, which are liquefied and stored in the tanks. This fuel is not mission critical, but the successful demonstration of this technology is key for future missions, as this should become the long-term solution for fuel production. Fuel produced during this time would be available for future missions, avoiding the need to land 45 tons of liquid methane each time. A fraction of the water can be purified for drinking and stored for oxygen production via electrolysis. This will be useful after Phase 4, which begins now. The crew travels to the Santa Maria and tows the components of the vase to a spot near Victoria and the main solar farm. There, the crew mounts or deploys the habitat. Whether it is an inflatable base, a modular one or another design exceeds the aspirations of Mars Direct 3. Once constructed and tested, the crew can stay on it for the rest of the mission if they so desire, using the oxygen produced by electrolyzing the water that they have extracted. Again, this is not mission critical. Machinery, 3D printing and or other chemical reactions are used to make basic bricks from in-situ resources. They are tested and, if they work, they're used to cover the habitat for radiation protection. At a safe distance from all structures, these bricks can also be used to make landing pads for future ships. After 1.5 years of productive construction, exploration and experimentation, the astronauts prepare for their return home. This is Phase 5. The preparation would include detaching the carbon dioxide electrolyzers from the Caravel, which will be useful pieces of machinery for future missions. It also reduces mass. Finally, a few days prior to the launch window, the crew is on board and ready. The Raptor engine propels the ship into a high G-force ascent profile into low Martian orbit, and then towards Earth. This would not in any way be a flags and footprints mission. The astronauts would leave behind an initial base, a fully functional fuel production system, significant energy infrastructure, and fuel for future missions. This is a strong starting point for a Martian colony, which is the ultimate aim of the program. All plans work in paper and PowerPoint, sure, but sometimes reality gets in the way and things don't go as planned. Thus, it is the job of the planner to take that into consideration, especially given the consequences of failure to the crew and society as a whole. Flexibility is key for adapting to such issues, and Mars Direct 3 is prepared to adapt to the harshest situations while keeping the crew alive. This is a list of contingency plans with the aim of making a failure a bad day, not a tragic one. What if Starship Victoria and/or Caravel Pinta crash? What if fuel production or panel deployment fail? ISRU is less likely to fail in Mars Direct 3, given that only the atmosphere needs to be harvested, and redundant instruments are carried which have already been tested by Perseverance. Nevertheless, it must be accounted for. The solution is simple. In the event that the first wave fails, the crew would not launch from Earth, meaning that the risk posed to the lives of the crew in this scenario is zero. What if any of the first two ships fail while the crew is en route to Mars? This would be an unlikely scenario, as it would imply that, after completing all objectives and being in standby, any of the first wave ships on Mars has a critical failure. Another trigger event would be a non-critical failure of the Caravel Niña that would make the landing on Mars too risky. Or another event such as an ongoing global dust storm. In this event, the free return offered by the 6-month trajectory would be utilized. Essentially, the Caravel would travel to Mars and, with little maneuvering, would be placed on an Earth-bound trajectory. The crew would safely arrive on Earth 2 years after their departure. What if one of the Raptor Junior engines fails on landing? In that case, the symmetrically opposite Raptor engine would shut down, with the remaining 4 increasing thrust to compensate and making a controlled landing. At full thrust, these 4 Raptor Junior engines would have a maximum thrust-to-weight ratio of 1.4, thus allowing the landing. In the very unlikely case of more than 1 Raptor Junior engines failing, if they're not symmetrically opposite, then all Raptor Junior engines would shut down. The main Raptor engine would then attempt a suicide burn on the Martian surface. This is not ideal, but it's a lot better than dying. Contingency Delta, crash landing on the Caravel. There is one situation in which death is unavoidable and no amount of planning could save, and that is a hard crash landing of the crewed ship. Previous contingency plans have already made it an unlikely event, but there is a variation that may also cause death if not accounted for. The ship may suffer an issue during landing causing a non-fatal crash landing. That is, a crash that the crew can survive, but which would render the ship inoperative. This would unquestionably be a dire situation, resulting in the loss of crew in most conceivable architectures. Mars Direct 3 offers a real possibility for survival. In this event, the crew would withstand the possible depressurization held by the seatbelts. A day of oxygen would be accessible to the crew via backpacks and/or life support systems if they have survived the crash. If the landing location is within a few kilometers, the crew may attempt walking to Caravel Pinta, which is equipped with everything the crew would need for their stay on the Red Planet and the completion of the mission. there is a chance that the crew may not be able to walk this distance in time due to injury or not adapting to the gravity in time. Another option is viable. The crew may remotely deploy and control the fuel tanker rover situated inside Caravel Pinta and drive it to their location to ease the transport to the backup ship. A lot of uncertainty is associated with Contingency Delta. The most important factors would be severe injury or death of crew members, or whether the tanker rover can be made operational. Thus, the results may vary from the possibility of partial survival of the crew to total mission success. As long as one crew member is not incapacitated, all survivors will likely return safely to Earth. What if the cruise ship lands far away? Mars-bound ships are sent on precise trajectories to their destinations with the aid of mid-course corrections. For that reason, it is highly unlikely that the crew aboard Niña could find themselves landing on the other side of the planet. It is possible, though, that it would land several hundred kilometers away from its intended landing location. In this event, Phase 1 would proceed mostly as normal. The astronauts would be safe inside the Niña and perform experiments and explore safely. There are two variants to this contingency. A. The Niña has landed within the range of the pressurized rover, approximately less than 500 kilometers. In this case, 1.5 months after the landing of the crew, the Santa Maria would land next to the first wave ships. The pressurized rover would then be autonomously deployed and remotely controlled by the crew to complete the trip to the Niña. Once there, it would be plugged to the solar panel grid deployed by the crew and fully charged. Finally, the crew would move to the Pinta and continue the mission as normal. The result? The mission may proceed normally. B. The Niña has landed within twice the range of the rover, approximately less than 1,000 kilometers. In this event, the Santa Maria would make corrections to land between the Niña and the other two ships. The rover would again be deployed and controlled by the crew to pick them up. Once charged, the rover drives the crew to the Santa Maria, where the astronauts deploy a small solar panel farm to charge the rover and complete the journey to the Pinta. What if the last ship fails? What if the water extraction or processing fails? This would substantially undermine preparation for future missions. However, unless the previous contingency was needed, the loss of the Santa Maria would not significantly endanger the lives of the crew, as methane has already been provided. A tragedy was avoided by not relying on water ISRU. What if there is a global dust storm? The most dangerous weather event on Mars are global dust storms, which can cover the sky for months. The most important risk associated with this situation is in case the energy supply relies on solar panels, as most of the sunlight will be blocked by the dust. This would be no problem for the fuel, as it was there even before the crew launched from Earth. For life support though, having battery capacity to last for months is unreasonably costly. Mars Direct 3 offers a more reasonable alternative, for which the astronauts will have a few days to prepare due to satellite early warning of the formation of a dust storm. The crew would board the Caravel, which, as described before, has redundant fuel cells to produce electricity from liquid methane and oxygen. The Caravel would switch to essential power only mode and consume the power produced by the fuel cells. Assuming that the rover next to it has 2 tons of combustible methane and at least the stoichiometric oxygen to combust it, and that the fuel cell is 20% efficient, the rover is essentially a 5,625 kWh battery. Assuming a power consumption of 200 kWh per sol, the fuel in the rover would last for 28 sols. In the remote case that the storm lasted longer, up to 3.2 tons of the methyl fuel on the Caravel could be consumed thanks to the extra stock of methane still stored at Victoria, increasing the duration to a total of 101.23 sols. If more fuel had been produced at that point with the local water, this may increase further. Lower power consumptions and higher fuel cell efficiency would increase the time and vice versa. Nevertheless, with most global dust storms lasting between 2 and 6 weeks, it is more than enough to survive any dust storm scenario, even with only solar panels. After the storm, if fuel from the Caravel was consumed, the crew would fuel it again using the tanker rover and the remaining fuel stored at Starship Victoria. Time would be lost, but the crew would survive and the mission may still be fully accomplished. What if the already unlikely global dust storm started just when they were about to leave the planet? If a global dust storm was suspected to be forming within 3 months of the departure, Contingency Mu would be triggered. This would not be possible in an architecture that relies on preparing the fuel during the entire mission. With the Caravel already fully fueled, the crew would prepare for liftoff. If the storm continues growing and getting closer, the crew detaches the carbon dioxide electrolyzers and takes off. Once in low Martian orbit, the crew would wait until the launch window and safely return to Earth. What if the Raptor engine fails during the return's ascent phase? Depending on when the failure occurs, a different variant is activated. This makes it a very complicated contingency plan, which is explained in more detail in the paper. In summary, if the Raptor fails instantly, the crew takes the fuel to the backup ship and tries again. If the Raptor engine fails during ascent or in orbit, the Raptor Junior engines would most likely be able to land the ship, though maybe far away. The most dangerous scenarios would be engine failure from 5 to 30 seconds after launch, or when performing the trans-Earth injection burn in Martian orbit. These scenarios are very unlikely, and the rest are accounted for. If a successful landing was performed with the Raptor Junior engines near the base, and enough fuel had been produced with local resources, another launch may be attempted with the remaining Caravel. Otherwise, Contingency Omega would be triggered. Contingency Omega is the last resource situation where, for whatever reason, after all of the contingency plans, the crew is still stuck on Mars. The crew would have enough supplies to survive until more ships arrive from Earth. Many options are possible depending on the cause of failure, but they range from sending replicas of the failed ships to landing the entire fuel requirement of a Caravel, using 2 starships or more if Mission Control wants to take no risks. Until then, the crew would have food to eat and more science to do. At this point, I hope to have convinced you of the robustness of the mission, providing layer after layer of contingency plans to ensure the survival of the crew. All of this with only 4 ships and an affordable price. No plan is perfect, and an engineering failure may put an end to any mission, but my goal was to give the astronauts the best shot possible. So, assuming that the mission went well, now what? What comes after Mars Direct 3? If all mission objectives were accomplished, future missions would focus on expanding the colony and fuel production, as well as ISRU of local materials. Aquaponics and mining, as well as 3D printing, should also be the focus. In the long term, these technologies would make the colony less reliant on Earth. A larger number of starships would carry redundant ISRU machinery for fuel production, as well as habitation and aquaponic modules for the expansion of the base. After the colony is functional and fuel production is secured, a larger number of ships would increase the scale, population and self-reliance of the colony. Eventually, return trips using starships would become viable, and regular crewed routes to and from Mars would be carried out using a crewed version. if the Caravel wasn't being used for exploration missions elsewhere or for lunar exploration, it would be rendered obsolete. This is the goal of the Caravel, but one needs to build a railroad before the horse cart becomes obsolete. The possibility also exists of doing a small-scale Mars Direct 3. This is the Mars Direct 3 version of a Flags and Footprints mission. Once regular missions are sent to Mars and rescue missions are always available, even rescue missions from the colony via suborbital flights, missions to explore all the locations could be conceived of using only 2 ships. One Starship similar to Victoria and one Caravel. This is useful for exploring multiple locations if one wants to make sure that the colony is built at the best location or for reasons of further exploration. Put another way, the big ship small ship strategy allows a Mars mission to be carried out with only 2 ships. The non-reliability on ice mining and the reduced number of ships and power requirement would still make it safer than the SpaceX proposed Starship-only system. However, as I've attempted to prove, adding 2 more ships would make for an extremely safe mission that lays the groundwork for a future colony. By now, I hope that you are convinced of the enormous benefits of using the big ship small ship strategy. The proposed Caravel ship would use the same main engine as Starship, be made out of the same steel material and use the same heat shield tiles as Starship. Given that a Raptor Junior-like engine needs to be developed for the lunar Starship, the Caravel would not need any additional piece of technology. The degree of commonality would make the additional cost relatively low. However, the most frequent objection posed against Mars Direct 2 and 3 is that the Caravel, or mini Starship, is not really needed. The Starship can do it all on its own. Elon Musk often says that the best process is no process, so why bother? Just launch a few more Starships and that's it. It's a legitimate question, so let's dive into it. Firstly, there is a version of Mars Direct 3 that works only using Starships. It requires more ships, but most of the contingency plans still work. Thus, I consider it to be an improvement over relying on ice mining from the beginning, at least in terms of safety. The problem with this view of the best process being no process applied to Mars Direct 3 is that, while technically true, at first glance one can miss the sense of scale. For a similar mission architecture, a Starship-only system would require 171 tons of methane delivered to the surface, so 3.8 times the amount of solar panels. This would be 98 tons in mass, filling the cargo volume of 2 Starships. A scale-out ISRU machinery and more rovers would also be needed, which would require additional ships. The alternative would be relying on ice mining and processing as SpaceX currently plans. But let's focus on this alternative Starship-only Mars Direct 3. An efficient distribution of mass and volume results in 4 Starships in the first wave and 2 in the second. A total of 2 Starships and part of the cargo of another one, so we could say 2.5, will be needed to emulate what Starship Victoria can do, and 4 Starships to replicate what a Starship and a Caravel could do. Thus, Mars Direct 3's Starship-only version could be accomplished with a total of 6 Starships. This can vary depending on the final cargo capacity of Starship. With 6 tanker flights per Starship and 2 per Caravel plus 1 Starship needed to support the return of the Caravel, Mars Direct 3 could be accomplished with 21 launches in the Caravel and Starship variant and 42 for the Starship-only variant. Even if reusability and chain production lower the cost of Starship further, landing a Starship on Mars requires construction, testing, cargo, loading, launch, and around 6 on-orbit refueling missions, as well as all the human labor associated with monitoring the trajectory and the landing. It should be noted that any reduction in Starship construction, launch and landing costs would also reduce the cost of the Caravel and Starship variant, making the proportional savings remain somewhat similar. On another note, there is a significant difference between the development and construction costs of a crew vehicle with a pressurized volume in the order of 650 cubic meters, which is Starship, than one in the order of 170, which is the Caravel. Crew rating the Starship can be a nightmare compared to the Caravel. The extra cost of development would be added to the extra cost of hardware for each launch. Taking the development cost of the Caravel, given all the commonalities with the Starship, and subtracting the cost of developing a crewed Starship version, and the cost of the extra launches required during the first years of Mars colonization, the additional cost of the Caravel would not be substantial, and it may even be a cost-saving investment in addition to the safety gain. Mars Direct 3 is viable using only Starships. However, an operation on Mars 4 times the scale will also require increasing the labor force. With the uncertainties associated with the first missions, this means risking more lives. Requiring 3 more critical landings and twice the amount of launches will also decrease the chance of mission success. In the case of SpaceX's currently disclosed architecture, the scale would increase to 9 times more power needed. Any failure, including in water extraction and processing, would lead to a contingency omega situation of the crew stranded on Mars. If ISRU did not work, rescue missions would be complicated, expensive, and very risky. Landing 621 tons of fuel on Mars, which would be required for a Starship loaded with 10 tons of cargo to have 6.5 km per second of delta V, would require 6 Starship landings, 36 more launches. Refueling in Martian orbit may reduce the number to 4, but would add another risk factor. Failure would mean loss of crew. In terms of safety, the risk of the crew being stranded on Mars is significantly higher, would affect a larger crew, and the rescue options can rely on 6 successful landings in the next launch window. If fuel and oxidizer had not been produced already, a solar power-based mission would not survive a global dust storm. Each Martian year, a global dust storm has a 1 in 3 chance of happening. Having to stay for 2 Martian years means a 44% chance. In conclusion, both Mars Direct 3 variants allow for several contingency plans, making them substantially safer than the currently disclosed SpaceX architecture. Mars Direct 3 Starship-only version offers significant safety gains just by itself, while cutting power production requirements almost in half. Using the Caravel and Starship system reduces these power production requirements by a factor of 9, while still increasing safety. Indeed, the best process is no process. That's why Mars Direct 3 takes out the water ISRU and the Sabatier reaction as mission critical, reduces the number of ships and launches, and cuts the power requirements by a factor of 9. As is tradition with Mars Direct architectures, Mars Direct 3 can also be adapted for missions to the Moon. This will be covered in another, shorter video to be released after this one. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge the work of Gustavo Higón and Juan Rodríguez, the volunteers who helped me by creating most of the beautiful animations you have seen in this presentation. The design of all of the proposed vehicles is subject to change, but Gustavo is also the one who designed the versions that you saw. To both of you, thank you for believing in the project and for helping me share it with the world. A word of appreciation is also due to Dr. Robert Zubrin for inspiring this architecture and giving permission for it to bear the name Mars Direct 3. Thanks to the Mars Society for providing a platform on which Mars Direct 3 could be presented and made publicly available. And thanks to you, the viewer, for watching.